Hello, I'm Mark Ellen. Thanks for clicking this word in your ear, the latest of hundreds of conversations David Hepworth and I have been having since 2006, 18 years, some between the two of us and some with musicians, authors, comedians and other people we like. If you'd like to help make sure that they continue, you might consider being a Patreon supporter by going to patreon.com/wordinyourear and check all the other entertainment we offer, or just by liking and subscribing. And now, on with the show.
Word down your way. Testing 2, 2.
Well, welcome to another edition of Word Down Your Way. I can still vividly remember the moment that I discovered They Might Be Giants. It was hearing the lines, "Not to put too fine a point on it, say I'm the only bee in your bonnet" in 1990 on Birdhouse in Your Soul. I can remember being absolutely smitten and thinking immediately, what colourful route would this group inevitably take, which has in fact turned out to include children's writing music for children and TV comedies and advertising. It's been an astonishing story.
I'm so happy to hear about your optimism. I think for most bands, you have a hit and it's pretty much immediately downhill after that, right? Like there's the life expectancy is not great for any band,
And that was 35 years ago, so fantastic.
It was, yes.
That's brilliant.
Going.
Well, John, it's lovely to see you, and we're going to talk in a moment about the end about the tour that you're about to undertake. But we're just going to take you back now to first records that you bought growing up. I think it was in Massachusetts. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes. I lived in New York as a child, but by the time I was of record buying age, I was living in the suburbs of Boston. And we traveled into Boston to do record shopping and so on.
Where did you buy records? And can you remember what you bought?
Sure. Well, there was a bunch of stores in Harvard Square, which I think some of them might still exist. I don't know, or they might have been revived. What with the vinyl, revival. But yeah, the ones in Harvard Square were called Discount Records. There was a chain called Strawberries where I actually wound up working, and in fact, so did John Flansburgh in a different store in the chain of Strawberries. So we both had record store jobs in Harvard Square, and there were a bunch of used record stores as well, and that was a place where you spent a lot of time because you could buy an LP for $1. In those places. And so that was kind of good, since a lot of the record buying you were doing was just based on looking at the album cover art.
Absolutely. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. Were you I used to work in a record shop. Did you give in to that temptation to be rather condescending towards customers? Were you ever guilty of that?
Oh, yeah, no. I was not a music snob at all. Well, working in the Strawberries chain, it was a much more of a mainstream. It was not a boutique record store. In fact, we were kind of chained to whatever the top releases that were being promoted were, and there was unfortunately, there was a playlist of those very small number of records that they were pushing. And so as a result, we spent the whole day listening to about 7 LPs, one of which, though, was One Nation Under a Groove by Parliament Funkadelic. So that was fun. But then there was a lot of miserable stuff we had to listen to as well.
What was the miserable stuff? Can you remember?
Well, I don't want to insult any other. I always say good luck to all bands, but just suffice to say there were some stinkers in there.
What were your own personal early enthusiasms?
Well, this is very embarrassing for me because when I was 14, I was very hypnotized by the music of Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. I think my brother introduced me to the album Weasels Ripped My Flesh, and I listened to it over and over again. And I kind of felt eventually like a little bit alienated from the vibe of Frank Zappa, just due to his. I think maybe it was a combination of the sort of condescension in his music and also the misogyny and stuff like that started to bother me. But I was very
and
much
also the
into
cover
that.
surely indicates of that record, because the cover
I love the cover. In fact,
anybody who doesn't know it is a revolting cartoon, isn't it? Illustration of a guy, and he's shaving, and his shaving electric razor is a weasel that is ripping his flesh. My God.
Yes, exactly. No, I that was actually the thing that I still like the illustration on the cover of Weasels Hurt My Flesh. I would say it was Neon Park was the
yes, it was.
That's right.
You're
absolutely
Little
right.
Feet.
Yeah.
Yes.
Designer. So that was an early enthusiasm. So you're only like 14, did you say? 14?
Yeah. I mean, my friends who knew me then will tell you I wouldn't shut up about Frank Zappa back then.
But you kind of grew out of him to some extent.
I did.
Yeah.
Eventually, I think what happened was I absorbed the punk ethos that you didn't have to be technically gifted to have good ideas and produce interesting music. And
which kind of bands were you interested in then?
Right. So
I think Costello and the Ramones were favourites of yours, weren't they?
Absolutely. Yeah. I liked the very poppy stuff. And I also liked the more noisy, Perubu and the Residents and stuff like that were also very interesting to me. And, I think I started to feel like there were a lot of different ways to enjoy music as I was getting into my later teens.
When do you start playing?
Right. Well, my original dream was to be a cartoonist when I was small. And then at some point, I guess we had a piano in the house and I just banged on it for a while until it started to feel like something that was welcoming and interesting to me. In my middle teens, I made friends with Mr. John Flansburgh, and I think we kind of imagined we could do interesting recordings. I think that was the first thing we wanted to do. Was he had a lot of recording equipment. He had a fancy reel-to-reel tape recorder, and so we did stuff together. Just made kind of semi-experimental, fairly self-indulgent recordings at home with lots of overdubbing. That was kind of
And these you were still at school at the time, weren't you?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and so these were songs you were writing. Can you remember any titles of them or anything?
Well, they weren't exactly songs. They were more like just sound pieces, I would say. We did do a cover of "Don't Worry, Kyoko Mummy's Only Looking for a Hand in the Snow."
Oh my Lord, that's
Yoko
brave.
Ono.
Wow.
Yeah.
Why did you choose that?
It was a parody, basically. We did a funny version where we were both doing Rod Serling voices. The host of the Twilight Zone.
Right.
Yeah. We were being him singing that Yoko Ono song. I don't know what happened to that recording, but probably.
So did you instantly recognize each other as kindred spirits? Can you remember? Did your eyes meet across a crowded room or anything like that?
Not exactly. We had a coterie of friends who shared a certain sensibility in high school. So we were just two people in a crowd of people who were all, fairly. I would say wiseacrey teenagers, cynical, kind of in a way, maybe not different from the other kids in the school. But we hung out together and we edited the high school newspaper together. And so I did creative stuff with a lot of these guys. But at some point, Flansburgh and I decided to get more serious about it.
So when you made your first experiments together, did you play them to anybody? Or was it just for your own?
Yeah, good question. I guess we had a few friends that we'd play stuff to, yeah. Actually, Flansburgh introduced me to this idea that you could make a cassette and mail it to somebody. When we eventually separated and went off to various colleges or different cities, we got into the habit of making these little cassette letters and sending them to one another. So I think that was part of the creative process, was having stuff to put on a cassette.
And didn't that develop into Dial a Song, the way that you
might say that. Yeah. I suppose that's one way of looking at it, is that eventually, and that was Flansburgh's idea, to set up a phone machine with an outgoing message that was a song. He just, he had this impulse to create something that people could access and sidestep the radio or the music store, or the record store, and just directly tap into what we were doing by calling us. So
every time you rang, every few days there'd be a different song on there, presumably.
Yeah, in fact, we had a machine that was based on, it had the outgoing message on a cassette, so it was very easy to swap the cassettes in and out. So we'd have a stack of cassettes and try and change them every day, and they'd go we'd cycle through them.
Did you feel when the internet came along, whoopee, suddenly all this is a lot easier?
Yeah. I don't recall saying whoopee. We were already getting on it. We'd toured and recorded by that time.
Right.
So the internet was just another. Actually, it was my wife who was more enthusiastic about it, and I was a little bit more of a Luddite. I think she said, you can throw away your encyclopedia now. And I was like, I don't want to, I like my encyclopedia.
Yeah.
But
but you must have been listening to music kind of way outside of sort of conventional rock and roll. Later on you did a version of Istanbul by the Four Lads. And the Four Lads, right, if I remember, were a, early 1950s kind of barbershop quartet, weren't they?
That's right, yeah.
How did you get to be listening to music like that? And what other things were you listening to?
I think it was a process of, the earliest things we were exposed to just immediately were the Beatles when we were very young. And then gradually we just expanded outwards in all directions. So I think partly there was this interest on both of our parts in music from before the official rock and roll era, or as it turned out, in the 50s, there was music simultaneous to the early rock and roll that had kind of been ignored,
like what sort of things?
Well, like the Four Lads, that had sort of been written out of the history in a way. There was at the time, by the 70s, there was this idea that the 50s were just the period of Elvis Presley, and it turned out there was a lot of popular music aside from that had sort of it'd sort of been a rewrite of history in a way. So it was just a process of getting interested in things that were less well known.
What were the acts around at the time when you were starting out that you thought were an influence or inspired you? Were there any other
of contemporaries?
Yeah.
Right. Well, our experience was, John and I moved to New York in the early 80s, 1981, and within a few years, then a couple years, we'd started performing in the East Village. We took a little while to figure out that this was a good place for us. So we had, in some ways, it wasn't even so much bands as other performers doing, kind of outside performance arty stuff that we began to make friends with and feel a kinship to. And I think that a lot of these acts maybe have disappeared, from history, but they seem like this incredibly vital thing at the time.
What kind of people?
Well, the people you might have heard of were Steve Buscemi, and he had a partner named Mark Boone, and they had a performance in the same little tiny rooms where we were playing, and it was just kind of a very it was a little bit like sketch comedy, but it was definitely more outside and more avant-garde than that. And there was a group that we were very close friends with called Watchface, and they did this. I can't even quite describe it, but it was a kind of rhythmic chanting that addressed all sorts of contemporary cultural tropes and ideas, and they were really brilliant and inspiring, and we became good friends with those guys. And so it was very much of a local scene in New York.
But these weren't conventional rock venues. Obviously, they were kind of like comedy or performance venues.
Yeah. Originally, we did the showcase at CBGB for a while, and we continued going back there occasionally. But we felt like our home were these little rooms where it was mostly performance art, and it was a very little scene, very local scene, and a very congenial scene.
Describe what you looked like on stage. What would you wear? Were the props?
There were props, actually. Yeah, we did have props. We had enormous paper mache hands that we wore, which show up in some of our very earliest videos. You can see a lot of the stuff that we were doing then. We had masks. There were quite a lot of props in the beginning, and then gradually we kind of shed that, and I think began to look more like a traditional rock band, I would say.
Tell me about you formed, or when you went to New York. You're in Brooklyn. Is that right?
That's right.
I formed in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn seems to have. It's a bit of a transatlantic view here.
Sure.
Brooklyn appears to be the center of New York. Everything in New York happens in Brooklyn. It was not always the case. Is that right?
That's right. Well, that's what happens in cities. I guess Westminster was a backwater at one time, right? And then the city was way east of that in London, and I think that's just a thing that happens. Brooklyn. We were in Brooklyn when they changed the phone numbers to create a separate area code for Brooklyn, and it felt like we were being kicked out of the city at that point. This was back in the 80s. You suddenly had to dial extra numbers to call Brooklyn. But yeah, gradually, and it's a really familiar process to any city dweller, gradually, the original ethnic groups that were there were starting to get moved over by young pioneer artists who wanted to pay cheap rents, and then gradually it became more yuppified, and now Brooklyn is full of high-end professionals, and there's high rises, and it's really turned into much more like a metropolis in the most, I think, unfortunate way. I think it's stifled a lot of the original cultural foment.
It was a kind of artistic community, wasn't it?
It was. It certainly felt that way. Yeah, and I'm sure to some extent it still is, but it's moved farther out. So I'm not even quite sure where the artists are living anymore. I live in a pretty yuppified part of Brooklyn, which was very working class about 30 years ago, I think.
Right. So you mentioned earlier about your hit. And then Mark started talking about Birdhouse in Your Soul.
Yes.
Is that how do you come to terms with that when you have a hit like that?
Yeah.
Is it a good thing or not?
I think for us, it was, it could have turned out a lot worse. I think there are bands who have a big hit and then will never be remembered for anything else. And we seem to have escaped that fate by drowning our hit in all sorts of other stuff continuously before and since. So we obviously have a huge catalog of songs, and I don't think people are just coming to hear the one hit in our case. I think people actually like the deep catalog, or most of the people. Anyway, the people that we encounter who are all in the front row are there to hear all the obscuro songs that we're doing.
Well, it gave you a world audience, didn't it? Really quickly.
Yeah. So yes, it did. Yeah. It got us over to your shores, and so that was great. Well, we're very grateful actually for that.
I wanted to ask that I think you've made at least 5 albums for children. So what made you decide to kind of take that slight side route?
Yeah, well, it was we kind of fell into it by accident. We were offered, a sort of smallish budget by Rounder Records to do a children's record. We were spending all our time in the studio at that time doing commercial work. We did music for Malcolm in the Middle and stuff. So we thought, oh, well, as long as we're here, why don't we do this one-off kids record? And we didn't take it very seriously. We were kind of thinking, this is just fun for us to do something other than the commercial work. And we were very much taken by surprise at the success of the kids record, the first one, which is called No, that outsold the album that we made for our normal adult audience that year. So we kind of, at that point,
that's an extraordinary situation to be in, isn't it?
Yeah, it was a big surprise. And and I think part of what was appealing about it to people was that we were not coming across as educators. We were not doing something that was remedial for kids. We were just making goofy songs up and more or less doing this thing we normally do, except that it was appropriate for kids. So that worked out really well, and we did as you said, we did a bunch more after that.
Have you done children's shows? Have you performed for children?
We have, we have.
And how did you find that?
I personally, and I think Flansburgh would agree, I find it super challenging. And we've said this over and over again. The reason for this is that kids are a tough crowd. They don't obey the normal protocols of rock shows where they don't feel compelled to face forward. They don't applaud necessarily after shows. There's no tension in their minds about that happening. In other words, it makes us nervous if people aren't paying attention or if they're talking during the show. Kids have no problem with that.
You've got no way of calibrating whether they're enjoying it or not. Is that?
I think they're just enjoying being alive, and they'd be happy even if we weren't up there. They'd be goofing around and enjoying themselves. So it's a bit demoralizing for a rock band, because we're up there, flogging our songs, and they're kind of seeming a little indifferent, I think.
You expect a little adoration being a rock star, don't you?
It's not so much, I wouldn't say adoration, but there's a formal thing with any performance where you want people to applaud and face forward and so on. We've always found it was surprising, but we did find it challenging. I saw something about the Sex Pistols doing a kid's birthday party, and kids. Did you remember this?
On Christmas Day.
Yeah, and the kids were, I guess, throwing cake at the band and stuff like that. And according to John Linnell, it was actually the funnest gig he ever played. But that wasn't my experience.
Well, if you like cake being thrown at you, then I suppose it would be absolutely sensational.
Then that would be good. Yeah.
So, what can people look forward to with your UK tour? What kind of thing are you going to be doing?
Right. Well, we have postponed this tour over and over again for various reasons, mainly due to the COVID pandemic. And so we were originally scheduled to perform tribute to our third album, Flood, which had at that time reached, I think its 30th anniversary or something like that. And now we're probably up closer to the 35th anniversary, but we are still, we've advertised it as a Flood tribute show. So that's what we'll be doing in the fall when we get to the UK, is playing our Flood anniversary.
So what do? You do the album pretty much in sequence?
We do the entire album. And we also play a bunch of other stuff, some of it from our most recent recording. And as I've said, like a lot of deep catalog will be in there. We are doing, I don't want to spoil too much of the show for people, but we are doing one very, this was a huge challenge for us. We initially said, well, we know how to play this album backwards and forwards. And then we thought, but now do we know how to play it backwards and forwards? And so as a challenge to ourselves, we learned one of the songs as if it were a backwards recording. So one of the songs off of Flood, we will be playing in reverse in Britain in the fall. And then, check this out, we will be videotaping the performance each night and then projecting it backwards so you can check our work.
That's amazing. So when you say, does that mean, I'm going to be technical here, but does that mean you're singing the syllables backwards? I mean,
correct. Yeah,
that's incredible.
Wow.
God.
This took us, I think, a couple of weeks to practice and learn. So now that we know how to do it, we're just going to keep doing it.
You've got to just give us a tiny burst of a line sung backwards. Can you do that?
I can recite it for you. Val Ruip, Val Stilobrafas. The song is called Sapphire Bullets of Pure Love. So, and luckily it's not a hugely long song. So it wasn't an enormous number of lyrics to try and learn. But yeah, we just listened to the recording backwards over and over again, and as did our musicians in the band. And then we rehearsed it and we played it, and then we listened to it backwards to make sure we were getting it right. And it was a sort of pointlessly difficult exercise, I would say. Although, a nice talking point and something I can talk to you guys right now about.
I know, and also I think the Guinness Book of Records, if it still exists, would be interested in that. Surely,
it really would.
That's going to be a first.
I don't know, actually. Like, interesting point. I don't know if it's
got to be a first.
So you record it
in a category, I guess.
You video it, and then you show it back, or you have the audio, and you put it the right way around, so people can actually work out whether or not it was accurate. That's what you
exactly. That's what we'll be doing. Yeah, and we've been doing it. We've been doing it night after night.
How accurate is it?
I would say it sounds like a bunch of people speaking English as a second language, which, as you can imagine.
That's fantastic.
Well, look, thanks very much for talking to us.
My pleasure.
And people can see you in September in the UK, and check your spelling and check your working out, as they used to say at school.
Check your working out. Show your work is what we say.
Thanks so much, John.
Yes,
thanks very much.
Lovely to talk to you.
Word down your way. Testing 2 2.